ダニエルさんは非政府組織新イスラエル基金を運営されています。新イスラエル基金がどのような組織なのか、パレスチナとイスラエル間の問題には団体としてどういうお考えをお持ちなのか教えてください。
So the New Israel Fund is a 44-year-old organization that is the largest support network for progressive liberal civil society in Israel. And by this I mean the organizations that work for human rights, civil rights, rights of women and LGBTQ people, the rights of immigrants, equality between Arabs and Jews, between Palestinians and Israelis. So sort of the liberal organizations in Israel are our organizations that we support. And we are the largest organization supporting democracy and equality for all in Israel. And our position, our ideology about the relationship between Palestine and Israel is that there must be two states for two people, each of whom is able to live in peace and security with its own right to self-determination. So we support an independent Palestinian state next to Israel, and we support those Israelis and Palestinians who tried to build bridges rather than tear them down.
この本を読むと、第二次大戦後に自分の国を分割されたパレスチナのアラブ人たちがいかに苦しい思いをしてきたか、しかし同時にユダヤ人がどうしてあの地にイスラエルを建国しなければならなかったのかがわかり、深いジレンマを感じます。パレスチナとイスラエルの関係を考えるときに、私たちはどこまで歴史を遡ってこの問題の起源を考えるべきなのでしょうか。
Well, first of all, I'm glad that you felt a deep dilemma after reading the book, because I think there is a deep dilemma. And those of us who care to try to understand the situation and hopefully support the Israelis and Palestinians working for peace, we should feel this dilemma. So I think you are absolutely right in feeling a dilemma. Sometimes I think, you have two sets of victims, and they're both really, truly victims of the world, of each other, and sometimes of themselves. And I think one thing I sometimes think is that you said that you really felt for the Palestinian people who suffered so much because of the establishment of Israel, but you also felt for the Jews who had no choice but to establish Israel. And I think sometimes that other than the Jews themselves, the greatest victims of anti-Semitism in Europe are the Palestinians, right? And so to answer your question, how far back do we go? We can go very far back with both of the peoples, as I write in the book. But I think for our purposes, we should understand that both the Jewish people and the Palestinian people have a very real and legitimate connection to this place, right? They are both peoples whose origins are in this place. And even though sometimes one side will try to argue that the other side isn't really indigenous, isn't really connected, that is a false argument. And we must accept and feel compassion for the connections of both Jews and Palestinians to this place. And that goes back a long time. For Jews, it goes back thousands of years to the origin of the Jewish people. And for Palestinians, it goes back many, many, many centuries because they have been connected to this place for a very, very long time. So that's the first thing I always want to say is that we need to go back and respect the real connections that Palestinians have to this place and the real connections that Jews have. In fact, let's say you were trying to convince a Jewish person that they didn't really have a legitimate connection, or a Palestinian person. You might make yourself feel better by having arguments to try to prove, but you will not change the way that person feels, right? They feel this connection. And I would argue it's a legitimate connection. To understand the current conflict, in answer to your specific question, I think we need to go back to the 1880s, so the end of the 19th century. And we see, an Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, the Ottomans who are declining. That empire will collapse in World War I, of course. And Palestine is a part of that empire, small little part of that empire, and in it are Arabs who are both Jewish and Muslim, and Christian and Muslim, and also a small Jewish community that has remained in Israel, in Palestine, over the centuries since the Romans kicked out the Jews. And in the 1880s, European Jews, understanding that there was terrible danger for the Jews in Europe because of the rise of European nationalism, where the Jews didn't quite fit, understood that there was a problem coming, that if as these empires ended, the Jewish people were not obviously French or German or Russian or Polish. They spoke their own languages. They had their own traditions. And even though many of them wanted to be French or German or Polish, they were not accepted. Unlike here in America or Canada, other multi-ethnic countries where the Jewish people, of course, there is anti-Semitism, but the Jewish people are accepted. They're a part of a mix of a country. But that was not the case in Europe. And so they assessed that the only way they could secure safety for the Jewish people was to adopt 19th century European nationalism in the form of Jewish nationalism or Zionism. And the only place they felt they could be safe was in what was then Palestine. And so from the 1880s, Jews began moving to Palestine to set up this new place where they could have self-determination and safety. Now, of course, there were already people living there. And sometimes that was something that the Zionists didn't pay a lot of attention to. But really things changed after World War I, when the British took over the governance of Palestine, which they held until after World War II. And in that time, the Jews of Europe saw the fascist rise, and they saw the Nazis and the fascists in Italy. And so they tried to come in ever greater numbers to Palestine. Remember, they were not welcomed into America or Canada or Australia or Japan or anywhere, right? So there's even a terrible story about a ship called the St. Louis, which left Germany full of Jewish refugees, went to Havana, Cuba, and was turned away on its way to Florida and went back to Germany, and the people were all sent to Auschwitz. So for many Jews, getting to Palestine was the only hope they had for life. And so they went to Palestine. After World War II, when the British finally said, we can't control this anymore, you've got uprisings of the Jews and the Arabs, they're fighting each other, they're fighting us, they handed it over to the United Nations, which ordered a partition, one Jewish state, one Arab state. This was accepted by the Jews and rejected by the Arabs. And we can understand, I think, why the Arabs rejected it, right? Because they were thinking, why are you telling me I can have half of my homeland, right? But we can also understand the Jews who said, what is our option? You have told us we can't come anywhere else in the world. Do you want us all to just lay down and die? So that's why I said at the beginning of your question that I feel that your dilemma is a true, honest dilemma. And it really is the only way of understanding this conflict.
アメリカでパレスチナとイスラエルの問題を人々が議論するとき、どれほどの人たちがソカッチさんが語る両国の歴史をちゃんと知っているのでしょうか。
I'm afraid that very few people really understand history. And so I don't know what the percentage is, but my daughters are both on college campuses. They're in college and university. And this issue is a very big deal in the American college campuses right now. And you maybe have heard in English, sometimes protesters chant, from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. I don't know if this makes sense in Japanese, but you've heard this. So a professor asked these students, he did a survey, and he asked them, what river do you mean? And what sea do you mean? And they couldn't answer that question. They didn't know the river and they didn't know the sea. So they feel understandably emotional about this issue, but very few Americans, whether they are sympathetic to Israel or sympathetic to the Palestinians, understand truly the deep history. If they do, I hope they will become sympathetic to both Israelis and Palestinians, and people who reject those in Israel and Palestine who choose violence over building bridges to each other.
イスラエルを建国したことが良かったか間違ったことだったのかを議論するよりも、イスラエルがいい国になれるように手を貸すことに時間と労力を注いだ方がいいと書かれています。イスラエルがいい国になるとはどういう状況になることでしょうか。また、どのような努力によってそうなっていくと思われますか。
Well, I want to be clear that I think that countries are there's really no such thing, I think, as a good country or a bad country. There are countries that in times in their history act in ways that we are proud of and we think are decent and moral. And then there are countries that act in their history in ways that, in my opinion, are not things we should be proud of. And our two countries are good examples of that, right? America, the United States and Japan today stand for a lot of wonderful things, but we've had very troubled pasts, of course. And I think Israel's no different. It's a country that is like any other country. And so when I say let's work to help those Israelis, as you put it, to be good, I mean the kinds of organizations that New Israel Fund supports, the people who are saying, look, there has to be a home here for both Palestinians and Israelis. There needs to be equality for all people, whether they are Jewish, Muslim, Christian, or nothing at all. There needs to be a place where everyone gets to live in peace and security and have equal rights. And that's really what I mean by helping a country to be better. In my opinion, being better means equality, peace, and justice for all citizens and for all people, and for and a non-belligerent or non-aggressive attitude towards your neighbors. So this is what I really mean when I say I would like us to, instead of just choosing a side, choose the side of the people who are working to make Israel a better place, as opposed to the people who say Israel right, Palestine right, Israel wrong, Palestine wrong. Let's work with the Israelis and Palestinians. We're trying to make something better.
本書ではパレスチナとイスラエル両国が和平を目指したオスロ合意の交渉に関してページを割かれています。ダニエルさんは当時オスロ合意の行方を見守りながら何を感じていましたか。オスロ合意がうまくいかなかった決定的な要因はどこにあると思いますか。
Well, that's a very personal question for me because in those years, as you might know from reading the book, I actually lived in Israel for a few years between 1993 and 95, which was really the height of the Oslo period. And I think that one of the reasons I devoted so much space in the book to this time, well, one reason was because it was the most serious, comprehensive effort to really make peace between Palestinians and Israelis. Right, there had been other efforts that had succeeded with Egyptians and Israelis, Jordanians and Israelis, but this one was about the Palestinians, the people who were living, in the same little place. And the other reason is because I was there for that and really witnessed it. People talk a lot about the failure of the Oslo Accords, but I argue that the Oslo Accords were not given time to fail. Right. In other words, there are many things that we now, 30 years later, we can look back and say, oh, maybe they should have done this differently, or they should have had this conversation first, or they should have, saved this issue to last. But the Oslo Accords were not given a chance to succeed. The Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, who was the leader of the peace camp in Israel, was murdered. He was assassinated by a radical fundamentalist Jewish terrorist. And shortly thereafter, the radical fundamentalist Palestinian terrorists from Hamas began blowing up buses and pizza parlors in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and murdering Israelis. And the radical right-wing Jewish settlers on the West Bank began demonstrating and becoming ever more belligerent. So the Oslo peace process may or may not have ultimately succeeded, but we will never know because it was murdered. It was murdered by the assassination of the prime minister and by the terrorist acts that followed. And, one of the terrible lessons of the Oslo, the murder of Oslo, is it is much easier to destroy a peace process than it is to build one. All you have to do is kill the right people and kill enough of them. And I see this now with the current war, where you can see Israeli and Palestinian hearts hardening against the other. You can see people's empathy disappearing. You can see them turning away from the idea that we must live together. And the terrible irony of this is that there is no other choice. You know, there are 11 or 12 million people living between the river and the sea in Israel and Palestine. You know, in big countries like Japan and America, 11 million people. That's smaller than Tokyo. It's the size of Los Angeles County. But of course, these people are in such a important place in the world that we pay attention to it because of how volatile it is. And until they recognize that the only solution is for them to figure out a way to live together with peace and respect and security, I'm afraid that we will not see an end to this conflict. But Oslo is so interesting to me because it was so far the last best chance for an end to the conflict.
Are we going to have such opportunity again in the future?
Well, I'm an optimist. I have to be to do my job. You know, again, when I lived in Israel, it was the 90s. It wasn't just Oslo. Look at Northern Ireland and apartheid in South Africa and the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall. You know, it really felt like the world was changing in the 90s. And I think many of us expected that Israel, Palestine would change too. And those other places did change. Now, in some cases, like in Northern Ireland, things have been pretty stable. In other cases, like in the former Soviet Union, it's been a disaster in many ways. And I think the lesson we learned from that is you never know. You never know. And so I don't give up hope that there will be another opportunity for Israelis and Palestinians. But I also believe that we must work very hard to support those Israelis and Palestinians who want that chance. And as you know, that's really at the end, the point of my book is to say, understand this, and then choose the side of the peacemakers, the bridge builders. Those are the people who we need to support.
本書ではイスラエルのネタニヤフ首相に関する言及もあります。ダニエルさんから見て、ネタニヤフ首相とはどのような人物でしょうか？
Well, he has served longer than any prime minister in Israeli history at this point in time. And when he began, I would argue that he was a right-wing, conservative pragmatist. But over the years of his leadership in politics, I think he has changed. And I think he is more comparable today to a person like Viktor Orban in Hungary or Donald Trump in America, maybe even a person like Putin in Russia, although I wouldn't quite go that far. But he is a person who, look, before the terrible war that began on October 7th, Israel was involved already in a terrible crisis when Netanyahu and his government were trying to destroy the power of the Supreme Court of the State of Israel because they wanted a country that would look a lot more like Hungary, where there would be a democracy really in name only. And so I think this is who he has become. He is a person now who believes that he is the only one who can lead Israel, and he no longer makes a distinction between his own personal and legal well-being and political well-being and that of his country. And I say legal well-being because, as you know, the Prime Minister of Israel has been indicted on 3 felony criminal cases. And only by staying in power has he been able to avoid the trials that are waiting for him. And of course, it's much more effective to be in a position of great power when you've been indicted with a criminal felony. Just look at Donald Trump, who wants to become the president again, mostly because he has also been indicted on criminal counts. And he knows it will be much easier for him to escape prison and liability if he's the president of the United States. And so Netanyahu, I believe, and so does a majority of Israelis, perhaps up to 80% who reject him now, we see him as a person who no longer cares first and foremost about Israel's security or rescuing the hostages, but he cares first and foremost about Benjamin Netanyahu. And I think that makes you unqualified to lead a country at a time like this, in my personal opinion.
If Trump wins, it's going to affect so much over this issue.
I don't want to think about it. But yes, you're right. It will be, it's my opinion that every single issue will be made much worse with Donald Trump as the president. Because Netanyahu is much smarter than Donald Trump. If nothing else, Netanyahu is a smart guy. Donald Trump is a profoundly incurious, narcissistic, wannabe bully. You can tell that to the Japanese audience. That's my opinion. And he looks at what happens in Russia 2 days ago with the murder of their major opposition leader by Putin, and he thinks to himself, why can't I do that? And so I think that someone like Donald Trump leading the United States at this moment is a catastrophe, not just for us in the United States, but for all of you in the rest of the world. And I am very sorry that we have even put you all in the position of having to worry about Donald Trump. I will just say that in our country, each of the states, the 50 states, has a very distinct political personality. And I live in California, and we are the anti-Donald Trump state. And we are also the 5th largest economy on the planet. So maybe if Donald Trump is elected, we will just become our own country and make an alliance with Japan and happily live together. Because it's an impossible situation if he is elected. And when it comes to Israel and Palestine, it will be a disaster like every other thing that he has touched, because he's only concerned with himself.
イスラエルではアラブ系の小政党がより集まってより大きな連合政党、ジョイントリストを結成し、2015年にはイスラエルの第3位の政党として頭角を現したと書かれています。ハマスとイスラエルの衝突で今イスラエルではナショナリズムが盛り上がっていると想像しますが、今後イスラエル政治はどのようなイデオロギーに傾いていくと想像されますか？
That's a very, very interesting question. First of all, the Joint List is no longer the 3rd largest party, so your surprise was understandable. It was a wonderful moment, but they split into various different smaller parties. Which happens in parliamentary democracies like Israel's a lot. It's a shame because they were able to really wield real power with that number of seats, and now they don't have it. As bad as things are in Israel, and as much as I think you are correct when you suggest that nationalism has really become much more popular for Israelis and also Palestinians in the wake of this conflict, there is something very interesting happening in Israeli politics. On the one hand, Israelis don't trust Palestinians anymore. They are no longer supportive of a 2-state solution at this moment. By the way, also Palestinians are the majority is no longer supportive of a 2-state solution. That's right now. Let's see where things are with different leaders one day. But what's very interesting is even as they become more nationalistic, even as they become less supportive of a 2-state solution and don't have any hope about how they're going to coexist with Palestinians after October 7th, Israelis reject Netanyahu overwhelmingly. And for the last year, but especially the last 4 months, in every single poll, he loses power. He is no longer the prime minister. His party collapses to less than half of its current level of support. And the opposition comes to power in Israel overwhelmingly so. So right now he has a very narrow 4-seat majority. All the recent polls, so he has 64 seats in the current coalition. If the elections were held today, the opposition would have 70 some odd seats. And Benny Gantz, who is the leader of the National Unity Party, who is an opposition leader who went into the government on an emergency basis just to be part of the war cabinet, he would be the next prime minister of Israel, and he would lead a center-right, center-left Arab coalition that would have overwhelming support. So even as Israelis have moved to the right and have become more nationalistic, Benjamin Netanyahu is so unpopular, both because of the perception that he is trying to save himself legally and politically, because he is seen as corrupt, because he is seen as the guy who tried to destroy democracy in Israel by shutting down the independence of the Supreme Court, and especially he is seen as the prime minister who is supposed to be Mr. Security, who allowed on his watch the worst day in the history of Israel and the worst day in the history of the Jewish people since 1945, when 1,200 people, mostly civilians, were murdered in the Jewish state, which was supposed to be the safe place, by the terrorists of Hamas. And not only was he the leader of the country that was unprepared, the intelligence, the military, the security warnings were ignored, and he is the person who is held responsible for that, not by himself, but by the people of Israel. Even in the response to the horrible events of October 7th, he is seen as having been incompetent, where regular Israelis had to step in to help rescue people from the border near Gaza, to give them food and clothing and medical care. The government sort of disappeared for days. And so I believe that, if elections were held today, we see that he would be thrown out of office. Anything can happen. Elections are not actually scheduled for another 2 years. Well, 1/3 says we want elections immediately. Another third says as soon as the war is over. So 2/3 of the public demand elections. That doesn't mean they will get them, but I would argue that Benjamin Netanyahu and his ultra right-wing national government are in big, big trouble right now. This is just my best guess. I think it is unlikely that there will be an election while the war is going on, the way it's going on now. And I think that Netanyahu knows that, and is one of the reasons why he has an interest in keeping this war going, because he knows as soon as the war is over, there will be committees of inquiry into what happened. How was Israel so surprised? And who will be ultimately held responsible? The prime minister, as he should be held responsible. So I'm not sure, they call him in Israel the magician, because he can get out of all kinds of dangerous places, and maybe he'll get out of this one too, but I think it will be very difficult for him.
本書ではイスラエル擁護団体 J ストリートについて解説されています。J ストリートは新イスラエル基金と主張が似ているという印象を受けます。アメリカのユダヤ人コミュニティにおいて J ストリートはどれくらい支持されているのでしょうか。
So for the third time, I will tell you that you are correct in your read of the book. You're a very good, careful reader. I'm honored that you read this book so carefully. So to talk about J Street, let me take one step back and say that for decades, the organizations in the American Jewish community that advocated on behalf of Israel claimed to represent the opinions of American Jews. And sometimes they did, and sometimes they didn't. But after the 90s, after the end of Oslo, especially when Netanyahu returned to power, when the gap between American Jews are very liberal, they vote for the Democratic Party, and as the gap between Israel and American Jews began to widen, J Street was founded, and the idea was the brand new Obama administration needed an ally in the Jewish community that actually believed that the way to support Israel best was to push it to make peace and to have a two-state solution. Now, that's a position that an overwhelming majority of American Jews have, and that the Democratic Party has. So the older organizations were much more conservative than most American Jews when it came to Israel. Organizations like AIPAC, right, which is a very powerful lobbying organization, had become perceived, I believe correctly, as a much more right-wing organization that was allied with the political right wing in Israel and the political right wing in America. They had a very awkward moment when Donald Trump, when he was running for president, spoke at their conference and got a standing ovation, and most American Jews looked at that and said, wait a minute, I don't want anything to do with this. So J Street stepped into this role saying the American Jewish community deserves an organization that will advocate and lobby at the U.S. governmental level on behalf of peace and a two-state solution. And so in that sense, J Street does represent the views of many Americans. It has been a challenge to AIPAC. It is still not as powerful as the traditional organizations. They have a lot more money and a lot deeper support over many decades. But J Street has changed things. And now there is this force on Capitol Hill saying to Congress people, look, we will support you if you support a two-state solution. Most Democratic Congress people support a two-state solution. And AIPAC, has withheld support from Congress people that don't toe the line of the current government of Israel. And J Street stepped in and said, we will provide that support. So they're not equal in power to the more conservative organizations yet, but they have changed the equation because now in Washington, D.C., there is a smart lobbying group that represents a more peace-oriented agenda, and that is the agenda of the vast majority of American Jews. And you are correct that their philosophy is very close to the New Israel Funds.
アメリカで若いユダヤ人の方と年配のユダヤ人の方がパレスチナとイスラエルの問題について語るときにどのような雰囲気になるのでしょうか。しばしば激しい議論になるのでしょうか。
Well, there's a saying. It's not just generational. There's a saying. It goes like this: 2 Jews, 3 opinions. Right? This is a joke, right? So, there and the serious truth is, within the Jewish tradition, even for Jews who are not religious, there is a very valuable emphasis put on debate, right? It's part of Jewish culture is that you are trained to never accept anything as it is. You question, you ask questions. And I think that serves the Jewish people pretty well in life. You don't accept the orthodoxy of whatever is told to you. You ask questions, you're skeptical. We see this, by the way, less in Israel. Israel has become more like every other country. But outside of Israel, the Jews really retain this questioning of authority, and I think when we look at some of the great Jewish thinkers from Einstein to Freud to Marx, these are all people who sort of, whatever we think of them, they ask, I'm not sure if the way things are is the way they need to be. So for sure, there is debate. You are also correct when you say, in general, younger American Jews are more liberal and more critical of Israel, and older American Jews are more supportive. And that's understandable, right? Because older people, they saw the Holocaust. My parents were alive. They were children then, but they saw the murder of 6 million Jews. And they saw the establishment of Israel when those Jews were not allowed to go anywhere else, the survivors of the Holocaust. And so they have this deep personal attachment. Younger Jews, and they saw an Israel that was like a little country against a huge Arab world, or that was at least the perception. Today, younger Jews, my kids, they see an Israel that is very powerful. It has one of the strongest armies in the world. It is clearly the great regional power, and they see it, they see it as a bully sometimes, as a country that oppresses a Palestinian minority, that even with its own Arab citizens doesn't treat them fairly. And then you have people like me in the middle who, got to see this glimpse of what a different Israel could be in the 90s during Oslo, which is another reason I think I focus on it in the book, right? It is an alternative. So you have many younger Jews who question the traditional support for Israel. Some have turned against Israel. Some have found a home in organizations like the New Israel Fund and J Street, where we can say we care very much about that place, but we're not going to advocate in support of everything Israel does, the way that AIPAC does, and maybe an older generation of American Jews might do. For the New Israel Fund, our organization, our leadership is both Jewish and Arab. So we really are a shared organization, a mixed organization. And that's a very comfortable place for a lot of younger American Jews who say, well, that's a vision of Israel that I feel good about. I don't feel good about a vision of Israel that is chauvinistic or conservative or militant. I want one that is trying to build a different kind of society. So the last thing, 2 more quick points. One, of course, I'm generalizing, and there are many older people who support a liberal vision and some younger people who are more conservative. the most important indicator of this is how religious a person is. So the more religious people are, the more they tend to be conservative when it comes to Israel and lots of other things. Not everyone, but that's a general rule of thumb. In Israel also, by the way. And the final point I'll make, which could open up a whole other conversation, older people are the liberals. People in my generation are kind of split, and young people are much more conservative, really conservative. And we understand why, unlike in Japan, right? Because in Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu has been prime minister for almost 15 years. His education ministers have been deciding what kids study at school. His generals have been running the army. And by the way, it's not like America, where in California, we have our own Bureau of Education, right? We have an education department. My daughters studied what the California state government wanted them to study. Donald Trump had nothing to do with what they study, and Joe Biden has nothing to do with what they study. But in Israel, it's totally centralized. Little country, centralized. Again, smaller than Los Angeles, smaller than Tokyo. And that centralized government educated young people with a very right-wing, very ultra-nationalist ethos. And so, of course, young people are much more right-wing. They weren't taught to be right-wing by their schools and by the army.